I'm just going to start with a story that I think illustrates some of what's possible now that wasn't possible really even 5 years ago. And the story starts here with this woman, Aurea Kola, who was in 2007 a blogger blogging under Kenyan Pundit in Nairobi. She was a lawyer working in Nairobi. And in December of that year, in December of 2007, there was a presidential election in Kenya with a disputed outcome. And immediately after the election, there was a horrifying outbreak of ethnic violence in that country. Two ethnic groups, Kikuyu versus Luo, began fighting. And Kenyans looked on horrified. The conversation obviously was everywhere, mainstream media, the blogs, as was by then usual. And then, a few days into the ethnic violence, the Kenyan government said, okay, media blackout. Right? No mainstream media allowed to report on the ethnic violence. And the blogosphere went from being just a place where the ethnic violence is also being discussed to being, for many people, not just the primary, but the only source of information. And Akola said, tell me what you're seeing, and I'll post it here. So people would come in the comments on Kenyan Pundit, and they would add their observations. Sometimes she would just let them run as comments. Sometimes she would take them and put them into kind of omnibus posts. And she did that for a while. And she said, I can't do this anymore. I'm used up. I could do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I still couldn't keep up. If only there was some way to automate this. And a couple of programmers in the comments section of her blog raised their hands and said, we could build that. And they sketched out what it was they wanted to build. And 2 days after sketching it out, they launched Ushahidi. The name means witness or testimony in Swahili. And Ushahidi, at the technological level, is simplicity itself. It takes a series of observations by email, over the web, by SMS, and places them on a map so that you can see a geolocated map, a rather geolocated aggregate of what people are reporting from the field. Since the Kenyan violence, it's been used to track elections in Brazil. It's been used to track snow removal in Washington, D.C., first world problems. It's been used to track the aftermath of the Haitian earthquake, both the need and the presence of supplies. An event so successful that it got endogenized. The Haitian government took it over and ran it, and now runs their own version. And most recently, the most recent large-scale implementation is in the aftermath of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Japan. And if you go to Ushahidi and you look at where it's been implemented, what you see is that there are now instantiations of this thing running worldwide. Now, we're all used to the sentence, this technology was invented in Mountain View, California, and it spread worldwide, right? I've got that sentence on a macro, right? This technology was invented in Nairobi, Kenya, and spread worldwide is a new kind of sentence, right? That this doesn't come from one of the traditional centers of technological innovation, but it is a piece of technology that, having been invented, has become the preeminent tool in its class in less than 3 years. That is in part because this is no longer just a question of technology design. As Eric Hirschman, one of the senior technologists on the project, has pointed out, everything that went into making Ushahidi existed for 5 years before Ushahidi did. The phones with SMS, Google Maps, web databases, all of that stuff existed. Even the SMS gateways were already widely available. What Ushahidi was is an example less of technology design than opportunity design. And the advantage the designers had wasn't that they were close to the tools, it was that they were close to the problem. They were able to articulate to the users, this is why you would use these tools in these ways. It's what Eric Raymond, the author of Cathedral and the Bazaar, calls a plausible promise. They could go to the users and say, if we all do this together, a good thing will happen. And indeed, they were able to live up to that promise and have lived up to it over and over again. So seeing things like this, and we have been seeing things like this over and over again these last few years, I asked myself a few years ago, essentially, what is Ushahidi made of? Right. And obviously, at some deep in the stack level, it's made of servers and cell phones and antennas and maps and so forth. But it wasn't possible to do something like Ushahidi until there was a surplus of society's ability to participate, until enough people had cell phones in their pockets at low enough cost that participating wouldn't cost them more money than the participation was worth. So that became my answer. Ushahidi is made of coordinated voluntary participation. You take away any one of those three legs and the stool falls over. If you get all three of them together, the stool stays up. Right? And that resource, the resource this is built on, I've taken to labeling cognitive surplus, which is made of two things. The cumulative free time and talents available in the world, and the presence of a network that allows those free time and talents to be identified and aggregated at very low cost. That's the resource that things like Ushahidi are built on top of. So when I was thinking about this, I needed a metric, right? If I'm proposing that this is a resource that people can build with, how big is it? And I didn't have any units, so I invented one. I started with Wikipedia, which is the largest example of the cognitive surplus that's broadly participatory, not just limited to programmers the way open source is, but broadly open to participation. And Wikipedia, at the time I started thinking about this is back in 2007, 2008. I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations with my friend Martin Wattenberg, who studies Wikipedia first at IBM, now at Google. And we figured that Wikipedia had taken on the order of 100 million cumulative hours to create by that point. It's a big number. Obviously, anything that takes 100 million hours is a significant project. But how big is that relative to free time overall? So I needed another metric. I took the obvious one, television, #1 use of free time worldwide. How big is television? So if you imagine a visual representation of television watching, Wikipedia has taken up 100 million hours to create. Television watching, 200 billion hours in the United States alone every year. Put another way, we spend a Wikipedia project's worth of time in this country every weekend just watching ads. So this is a big number, right? There is an enormous amount of disconnected free time that we've largely chosen to use watching television in the 20th century. And increasingly people are participating in the media environment. Yes?
Yeah, just to understand, the 100 million hours was to the creation of Wikipedia?
Yeah, from about 2001 to about 2008.
That's online time for users?
No, for editors, not for readers,
Right.
just to make it.
And the TV?
TV watching, right, we watch in this country around 200 billion hours a year every year. So, in fact, rendered graphically, Wikipedia is here. That the entire project in 1 year. Yes, ma'am?
Just clarification, 200 billion hours, is that for the entire US, or is it per person?
No, it can feel like 200 billion hours if you're watching reality TV, but no, that is cumulative to the country. Worldwide, it is over 1 trillion. So the point here is that carving out even a tiny fraction of this time, if you can create something that gets a small number of people to give up a small percentage of their free time away from television or whatever other activity, you can, in accumulation, get an enormous amount of value out of that change. Right? This way of working, I think we can date to 1991, the day that Linus Torvalds popped up on Comp OS Minix on Usenet, where I think Brad and I first met, in fact. Not on OS Minix, but on Usenet.
I'm not that old. I bleach my beard every morning with peroxide.
That's right. Yes, we both just got here. And even before he'd called it Linux, he said, hey, I'm building an operating system. Who's in? Right? This is demonstrably a crazy way to build an operating system, because operating systems require, famously, tight, highly focused teams. And Linus just cast his bread upon the waters. What he got from this mail, which was the first, or this message, which was the first public description of what became Linux. What he got was nothing more than half a dozen people raising their hands saying, yeah, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could kick in. But all those half dozen people had to do was make an operating system that would be interesting to another half dozen people. And all that dozen people had to do was make an operating system that would be interesting to another dozen people. And you see where that logic plays out. 20 years later, Linux doesn't just own the cloud. The cloud would be inconceivable without Linux. The cloud is based on the ability to deploy operating systems like water with no per unit licensing or any of the rest of it. Right? And Eric Raymond, writing about this in Cathedral and the Bazaars, said, and I think this is the best description of it ever written, the first project for which a conscious and successful effort to use the entire world as its talent pool was made. That's the cognitive surplus. The idea that, in fact, if you were on Usenet in 1991 and you were on Comp OS Minix, you were actually talking to a sizable subset of the people who care about Unix-like operating systems that run on Intel chips. And for the first time, it didn't matter where people lived. In fact, the half dozen people who held up their hands to help line us out, one of them was in Finland, one of them was in New Zealand, one of them was around here near San Jose. Right? Linux was a tiny global effort. Right? And that sounds strange to ears tuned by the 20th century, where global is supposed to mean really big. But in fact, in an environment like this, you can have things that are tiny and global at the same time. And that's what Linus started with. That pattern has now spilled out into the rest of society, because what the geeks were doing in 1991, which is slicing up their interests and then making them available for various kinds of public consumption and access, has now become worldwide. You get things like Pickup Pal, which says, what if we reconceive of the transportation problem not as an infrastructure problem, but as an information problem? What if we add no new roads and no new cars and no new trains? What if we just add information about who's going from point A to point B at the same time? Pickup Pal worked so well that they got sued out of business momentarily in Ottawa on the grounds that a carpooling service that was efficient was illegal, which turned out to be true under Ottawa law. And they were sued by the bus company, who said essentially unfair competition. And the law as written did indeed say that. And so a second Save Pickup Pal campaign was kicked off. So many people complained to their legislatures that the law was changed to allow for this kind of service.
I want to talk to you today about something the open source programming world can teach democracy. But before that, a little preamble. Let's start here. This is Martha Payne. Martha's a 9-year-old Scot who lives in the Council of Argyll and Bute. A couple months ago, Payne started a food blog called Never Seconds. And she would take her camera with her every day to school to document her school lunches. Can you spot the vegetable? And as sometimes happens, this blog acquired first dozens of readers, and then hundreds of readers, and then thousands of readers as people tuned in to watch her rate her school lunches, including on my favorite category, pieces of hair found in food. This was a 0 days. That's good. And then 2 weeks ago yesterday, she posted this. A post that read, "Goodbye." And she said, "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but my head teacher pulled me out of class today and told me I'm not allowed to take pictures in the lunchroom anymore. I really enjoyed doing this. Thank you for reading. Goodbye." You can guess what happened next, right? The outrage was so swift, so voluminous, so unanimous, that the Council of Argyll and Bute reversed themselves the same day and said, we would never censor a 9-year-old, except, of course, this morning. And this brings up the question, what made them think they could get away with something like that? And the answer is all of human history prior to now. So, what happens when a medium suddenly puts a lot of new ideas into circulation? Now, this isn't just a contemporaneous question. This is something we faced several times over the last few centuries. When the telegraph came along, it was clear that it was going to globalize the news industry. What would this lead to? Well, obviously, it would lead to world peace. The television, a medium that allowed us not just to hear, but see, literally see what was going on elsewhere in the world. What would this lead to? World peace. The telephone? You guessed it, world peace. Sorry for the spoiler alert, but no world peace, not yet. Even the printing press was assumed to be a tool that was going to enforce Catholic intellectual hegemony across Europe. Instead, what we got was Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the Protestant Reformation, and, the 30 Years' War. Right? So what all of these predictions of world peace got right is that when a lot of new ideas suddenly come into circulation, it changes society. But what they got exactly wrong was what happens next. The more ideas there are in circulation, the more ideas there are for any individual to disagree with. More media always means more arguing. That's what happens when the media space expands. And yet, when we look back on the printing press in the early years, we like what happened. We are a pro-printing press society. So how do we square those two things? That it leads to more arguing, but we think it was good. And the answer, I think, can be found in things like this. This is the cover of Philosophical Transactions, the first scientific journal ever published in English in the middle of the 1600s. And it was created by a group of people who'd been calling themselves the Invisible College, a group of natural philosophers who only later would call themselves scientists. And they wanted to improve the way natural philosophers argued with each other. And they needed to do two things for this. They needed openness. They needed to create a norm which said when you do an experiment, you have to publish not just your claims, but how you did the experiment. If you don't tell us how you did it, we won't trust you. But the other thing they needed was speed. They had to quickly synchronize what other natural philosophers knew, otherwise you couldn't get the right kind of argument going. The printing press was clearly the right medium for this, but the book was the wrong tool. It was too slow. And so they invented the scientific journal as a way of synchronizing the argument across the community of natural scientists. The scientific revolution wasn't created by the printing press. It was created by scientists, but it couldn't have been created if they didn't have a printing press as a tool. So what about us? What about our generation and our media revolution, the internet? Well, predictions of world peace? Check. More arguing? Gold star on that one. I mean, YouTube is just a gold mine. Better arguing? That's the question. So I study social media, which means, to a first approximation, I watch people argue. And if I had to pick a group that I think is our invisible college, is our generation's collection of people trying to take these tools and to press it into service, not for more arguments, but for better arguments, I'd pick the open source programmers. Now, I tell you all of this not to convince you that it's great that open source programmers now have a tool that supports their philosophical way of working, although I think that is great. I tell you all of this because of what I think it means for the way communities come together. Once Git allowed for cooperation without coordination, you start to see communities form that are enormously large and complex. Right? This is a graph of the Ruby community. It's an open source programming language. And all of the interconnections between the people, this is now not a software graph, but a people graph, all of the interconnections among the people working on that project. Right? And this doesn't look like an org chart. This looks like a disorg chart. And yet, out of this community, but using these tools, they can now create something together. So there are two good reasons to think that this kind of technique can be applied to democracies in general, and in particular to the law. When you make the claim, in fact, that something on the internet is going to be good for democracy, you often get this reaction. Which is Are you talking about the thing with the singing cats? Like, is that the thing you think is going to be good for society? To which I have to say, here's the thing with the singing cats. That always happens. Right? And I don't just mean that always happens with the internet. I mean that always happens with media, full stop. It did not take long after the rise of the commercial printing press before someone figured out that erotic novels were a good idea. You don't have to have an economic incentive to sell books very long before someone says, hey, you know what I bet people would pay for? It took people another 150 years to even think of the scientific journal, right? So the harnessing by the invisible college of the printing press to create the scientific journal was phenomenally important. But it didn't happen big, and it didn't happen quick, and it didn't happen fast. So if you're going to look for where the change is happening, you have to look on the margins. So the law is also dependency related. This is a graph of the US tax code and the dependencies of one law on other laws for the overall effect. So there's that as a site for source code management. But there's also the fact that the law is another place where there are many opinions in circulation, but they need to be resolved to one canonical copy. And when you go onto GitHub and you look around, there are millions and millions of projects, almost all of which are source code. But if you look around the edges, you can see people experimenting with the political ramifications of a system like that. Someone put up all the WikiLeaks cables from the State Department along with software used to interpret them, including my favorite use ever of the Cablegate cables, which is a tool for detecting naturally occurring haiku in State Department prose. Right. The New York Senate has put up something called open legislation, also hosted on GitHub, again for all of the reasons of updating and fluidity. You can go and pick your senator, and then you can see a list of bills they have sponsored. Someone going by DiveGeek has put up the Utah Code, the laws of the state of Utah, and they've put it up there not just to distribute the code, but with the very interesting possibility that this could be used to further the development of legislation. Somebody put up a tool during the copyright debate last year in the Senate saying, it's strange that Hollywood has more access to Canadian legislators than Canadian citizens do. Why don't we use GitHub to show them what a citizen-developed bill might look like? And it includes this very evocative screenshot. This is called a diff, this thing on the right here. This shows you, for text that many people are editing, when a change was made, who made it, and what the change is. The stuff in red is the stuff that got deleted. The stuff in the green is the stuff that got added. Programmers take this capability for granted. No democracy anywhere in the world offers this feature to its citizens for either legislation or for budgets, even though those are the things done with our consent and with our money. Right? Now, I would love to tell you that the fact that the open source programmers have worked out a collaborative method that is large-scale, distributed, cheap, and in sync with the ideals of democracy. I would love to tell you that because those tools are in place, the innovation is inevitable. But it's not. Part of the problem, of course, is just a lack of information. Somebody put a question up on Quora saying, why is it that lawmakers don't use distributed version control? This graphically was the answer. Right? And that is indeed part of the problem, but only part. Right? The bigger problem, of course, is power. The people experimenting with participation don't have legislative power, and the people who have legislative power are not experimenting with participation. They are experimenting with openness. There's no democracy worth the name that doesn't have a transparency movement. But transparency is openness in only one direction. And being given a dashboard without a steering wheel has never been the core promise a democracy makes to its citizens. So consider this. The thing that got Martha Payne's opinions out into the public was a piece of technology. But the thing that kept them there was political will. It was the expectation of the citizens that she would not be censored. Right? That's now the state we're in with these collaboration tools. We have them. We've seen them. They work. Can we use them? Can we apply the techniques that worked here to this? T.S. Eliot once said, one of the most momentous things that can happen to a culture is that they acquire a new form of prose. I think that's wrong, but I think it's right for argumentation, right? A momentous thing that can happen to a culture is they can acquire a new style of arguing. Trial by jury, voting, peer review, now this. A new form of arguing has been invented in our lifetimes, in the last decade, in fact. It's large, it's distributed, it's low cost, and it's compatible with the ideals of democracy. The question for us now is, are we going to let the programmers keep it to themselves, or are we going to try and take it and press it into service for society at large? Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you.